Okay, time for a video presentation for SDV602 milestone 3. So I made the decision, Todd, don't hate me for this, that rather than try and touch very briefly on all the various things that we've implemented into the project, that I'd just actually focus in on something that's been a big part of the final milestone and something that I've sort of spent a bit of time messing around with over the semester. So I'm just going to talk about JSON. Now, what is JSON? JSON stands for a JavaScript object notation, and it's a lightweight data interchangeable format that uses a human readable text to store and transmit data objects. So it's a really popular data format that's used quite widely in lots of different ways, but the main way that you kind of come often see JSON is the classic thing between a front-end web client and a back-end web server passing data backwards and forwards. It was originally based on a subset of JavaScript, but basically supported by all the main programming languages at this stage. So a little bit about the history of JSON. It was popularized by a chap called Douglas Crockford in 2000-2001 at State Software. Now, it's an interesting one because he's not actually claiming that he invented it. He's basically just really kind of got on board with it and found that it fulfilled the requirements that he had for the projects that he was working on at the time. But yeah, he's basically said that he saw it as early as '96 being used by employers at Netscape when he worked there. But anyway, he really got on board with it, and he named it and sort of branded it a bit JSON, and he purchased the domain JSON.org, which is still JSON.org. In fact, it's still there. It's got really ugly color scheme, but it's really informative and kind of interesting. Now, JSON really took off in 2005 with the emerging Ajax approach to web development, which Ajax, just as a brief aside, is asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And it basically was a sort of way to really have a dynamic web page where you were rather than reloading whole pages, you were just kind of reloading objects on the page with data from the server. So hence you're doing a lot of APIs and moving data around. And of course, this was originally done in XML, which was was at that time the really popular data format for doing these kind of APIs. But of course, as people sort of started to get into this more and more as a web development technique, it also was pretty obvious that JSON would actually do the same thing and was actually way easier to work with. So anyway, brief aside, but yeah, JSON was first standardized in 2013, and then it was sort of re-standardized and elevated a bit in 2017. So here's a little sort of example of how JSON works. Essentially, we create a variable, and in there we essentially make an object, and in that object we use this classic sort of name and value pairing, and this is really distinctive of JSON. You always sort of have this object here with the curly brackets, and then you have these name value pairs, often in strings or sometimes booleans or integers, but usually in just quite straightforward data types. And so this is how we would write it when we're creating an object to pass. And then on the other side of it, when we actually want to read the object, then it's really something quite simple. Like here, if we were console logging these, basically here's a little bit of a string, but this is the actual what we're pulling in. And we're just calling the name of the object, JSON, and the excuse me, name of the value of the the name of the value, sorry, out of the value name value pair in the JSON file. So that simple dot notation, that's really handy, and this is the kind of output that we would expect to get from that little console log that we've got here. Sorry, just get a glass of water. Excuse me. Now, so what are the advantages of JSON? It's a very compact and lightweight format that basically using it improves the efficiency of APIs pretty noticeably. and it's really widely supported. So all of the main browsers support it. In fact, I think all browsers support it. So that's great for applications and things. It means that they're going to work the same way on all the different browsers, and there's going to be compatibility there. JSON doesn't have a strict schema, so it's really flexible. And this is kind of a pro and a con about it. Some people are not wild about that and sort of dirty data and stuff like that because there's not a strict schema. Anyway, sorry, digressing slightly. JSON is very easy to read, sort of no matter what programming language you're using it in. It's pretty distinctive and quite clear and easy to see what you're doing. And because you can use arrays in JSON and you can also nest JSON objects and things like that, you can really sort of pack the information in there, and it's really easy to sort of transfer and then access that information on the front end. And yep, it's concise formatting because of that sort of name value pair. It's just a very sort of easy logical thing to think of, like, oh, person dot name and things like that just kind of make a lot of sense when you're kind of dealing with it. Now, the disadvantages of JSON is there's no error handling on JSON calls. If the call works, you get your data, and that's great. If it doesn't, then there's nothing built in. You're not going to get a guarantee like you would say with a sort of, I don't know, an HTTP or something like that, where you're always kind of going to get your data. It's all or nothing sort of a scenario. Now, multi-line strings are not supported, and that can sort of present issues with readability as things sort of go really far along horizontally. JSON also doesn't have any sort of built-in security to it as a data format. It's essentially, it is what it is. And the security of it is basically determined by the security of the application and the server that are passing the data in JSON format. This is one that really actually bugs people, and there's no ability to add comments or attributes or any other sort of metadata to JSON information, and that can kind of, people can feel that that's going to be a real issue in the future because there's no instructions, there's no explanations. It's just very basic sort of data. And JSON it's got a reasonably limited amount of data types, and so it just uses the singular number data type, and something about the floating decimal point used in that actually can cause some issues, and it's sort of not ideal in some scenarios, so that bugs people a little bit as well. Now, it's a real thing with developers, apparently, the JSON versus XML, and everybody has their preferences and their faves and their one that they just love to kick around and get the boot in. But essentially, this is just a little bit of a comparison of them. And essentially, you can kind of see that neither one is perfect, and it's a little bit of a scenario where in certain use case scenarios, one is better than the other. JSON essentially is really lightweight, very fast, very simple, but very basic, and has issues with just being a bit loose and data integrity and things like that. Whereas XML kind of has the advantages to the other way. It's more complex, but the complexity allows you to do a lot more stuff. You can put comments and metadata in. It uses schemas that allow commenting. It's kind of it's just, and essentially what would be best would be dependent on the use case. And in fact, interestingly enough, XML, that was the previous standard and has kind of been overtaken by JSON in recent years, is actually really, it's kind of in a way the better thing, because XML is basically the same code language as HTML, so it all really would like to talk together and works together really well. Whereas JSON is JavaScript based, so you're kind of jamming JavaScript into HTML, which is a little bit awkward, but it's just one of those ones. And yeah, which kind of leads into the future of JSON. And essentially, the future looks pretty golden. It's basically at the moment it's kind of like the first choice for data exchange on the web, and there no one can see that really changing anytime soon. And that's probably actually only going to become more of a thing with the growth of Internet of Things, because this, of course, Internet of Things requires a lot of lightweight data exchange with minimal overheads and little devices that don't have a lot of computing power or memory and stuff like that. And let's face it, JSON is really widely supported by like all the industry big players like Google and Facebook and everyone like that uses JSON. So, when those guys all support a format, it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. They've kind of got too much invested in it. But yeah, and as I mentioned, it is important to note that JSON isn't perfect and that there are some little issues there that, in some scenarios, it wouldn't actually be the ideal choice. And little lightweight web applications where you're really sort of valuing that fast turnover of data and stuff, then that's great. But with something with more complexity that requires greater data integrity and things like that, then you definitely probably want to consider a different format. Sorry, perhaps XML. So, um, and just one little aside, I almost forgot, but there's a funny little side story when Douglas Crockford originally licensed the JSON file format, and it's an open source license, so it's MIT license, so it's all public and open source. He did include a little additional clause that said the software should be used for good and not evil, which was a bit of a sort of commentary on the political landscape at the time in America. But it did actually come back to be a little bit of an issue for them because a few places, I think Google perhaps was one of them, didn't want to have JSON as in their sort of open source file exchanges and things like that because they said, well, this do no evil restriction is it's not open source if you've got a restriction on there. So don't know about that. Of course, it's sort of like, yeah, but you really want to be doing evil with the software? Anyway, just a little aside. Anyway, hope you enjoyed my little chat about JSON and yeah, cheers.